The mists that rose from the vast wetlands of northern Germania in the early centuries of the Common Era concealed more than just the treacherous paths through bog and fen. They shrouded the emergence of a people whose impact on European history would resonate for millennia. The Saxons, whose very name would become synonymous with England itself, began their remarkable journey not as conquerors of distant shores, but as scattered tribes eking out existence in one of Europe's most challenging landscapes. Their story represents one of history's most profound transformations, from disparate marsh dwellers to kingdom builders, from pagan warriors to Christian kings, from tribal confederations to the architects of what would become the English nation. The northwestern European plain that stretched from the Rhine Delta to the Jutland Peninsula presented a landscape unlike any other in the ancient world. Here, where the North Sea's restless waters met an equally restless land, nature had created a world of constant change. Twice daily, massive tides transformed dry land into temporary seas, while seasonal floods could submerge entire regions for weeks at a time. The coastline itself refused permanence, shifting with each storm, creating new islands while swallowing others, forcing human inhabitants into a perpetual dance of adaptation and survival. This was the crucible that forged the Saxon character, a people as fluid and adaptable as the waters that surrounded them, yet as enduring as the ancient oaks that anchored their sacred groves. Archaeological evidence from the coastal settlements of what would become Frisia and Lower Saxony reveals communities that had mastered the art of living with water rather than simply beside it. The Terpen, artificial dwelling mounds that rose like islands from the marshy landscape, represented more than mere practical responses to flooding. They embodied a worldview that saw human habitation not as dominance over nature, but as negotiation with it. Each terp, painstakingly constructed from layers of clay, dung, and refuse accumulated over generations, told the story of families who had chosen to remain and adapt rather than flee to higher ground. Excavations at sites like Feddersen have revealed sophisticated engineering, with drainage systems, reinforced foundations, and carefully planned expansions that accommodated growing populations while maintaining structural integrity against the constant threat of water. The material culture unearthed from these early Saxon settlements speaks to a society of remarkable sophistication despite, or perhaps because of, their challenging environment. Pottery fragments show trade connections extending far beyond their immediate territories, with Roman amphorae appearing alongside locally produced vessels, decorated with distinctive geometric patterns that would later influence Anglo-Saxon art. Metalwork from the period demonstrates advanced techniques in both iron and bronze, with weapons and tools showing a practical efficiency that prioritized function over ostentation. The famous bog bodies discovered throughout Saxon territories provide haunting glimpses into religious practices that saw the wetlands not as obstacles, but as sacred thresholds between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. The Saxon tribal structure that emerged from this landscape represented a unique solution to the challenges of political organization in a decentralized world. Unlike the hierarchical kingdoms of the Mediterranean or the empire that Rome had constructed through conquest and administration, Saxon society developed along horizontal lines of association. The earliest Saxon communities operated through what archaeologists term segmentary societies, groups that could fragment or coalesce as circumstances demanded without permanent hierarchical structure. This organizational flexibility proved to be one of their greatest strengths, allowing them to respond rapidly to threats while avoiding the vulnerabilities that came with centralized leadership. The social fabric of early Saxon society was woven from threads of kinship, oath-binding, and shared territorial identity. The Cipi, or extended kinship group, formed the fundamental unit of social organization, encompassing not just blood relatives but also individuals incorporated through marriage, adoption, or formal alliance. These groups typically comprised between 30 and 50 individuals who shared collective responsibility for each member's actions, a system that created powerful incentives for maintaining social order without formal law enforcement. The concept of wergild, the man price that could be paid to compensate for injuries or death, reflected a sophisticated understanding of conflict resolution that prioritized restoration over retribution. Within this kinship framework operated the institution of the gefolge or warband, which would profoundly influence medieval European military culture. Young warriors, typically drawn from multiple cipae, would attach themselves to successful war leaders through ceremonies of oath-taking that created bonds considered more sacred than blood ties. These warrior bands operated as semi-autonomous units, raiding neighboring territories during summer campaigns, while wintering in their home communities. The spoils of these expeditions, cattle, slaves, precious metals, and prestigious goods, flowed through complex networks of gift-giving and redistribution that reinforced social bonds while creating opportunities for advancement based on martial prowess, rather than birth alone. The religious landscape of early Saxon society reflected the complex interplay between local traditions and broader Germanic cosmology. While sharing core deities with other Germanic peoples, Warden, Thunor, and Tiw among others, Saxon religious practice showed distinct regional variations that reflected their unique environment. The marshlands and forests of their homeland were populated with countless local spirits and supernatural beings that required propitiation and respect. Sacred groves, often centered around ancient trees or natural springs, served as focal points for religious observance, with archaeological evidence suggesting these sites remained in use for centuries, accumulating layers of votive offerings that speak to their enduring significance. The Saxon calendar, reconstructed from later Anglo-Saxon sources and continental references, reveals a society deeply attuned to natural cycles and agricultural rhythms. The year was divided into two primary seasons, summer and winter, with elaborate ceremonies marking the transitions between them. The festival of Eostre, celebrating the spring equinox, involved complex rituals of renewal and fertility that would later influence Christian Easter tradition. Similarly, the autumn feast of winter nights marked the beginning of the dark season, when the boundaries between worlds grew thin and the ancestors drew close to the living. These observances were not merely religious, but social events that brought scattered communities together, reinforcing shared identity while providing opportunities for trade, marriage negotiations, and political alliance building. The economic foundations of Saxon society rested on a sophisticated mixture of agriculture, animal husbandry, craft production, and increasingly, maritime trade. The heavy soils of northern Germany required different agricultural techniques than those employed in the Mediterranean world, leading to innovations in ploughing technology and field management that would later transform European agriculture. The Saxon heavy plough, with its iron coulter and mouldboard, could turn the dense clay soils that defeated lighter implements, opening vast areas to cultivation that had previously been considered marginal. This technological advantage would prove crucial in their later colonization of Britain, where similar soil conditions prevailed across much of the landscape. Animal husbandry played an equally important role in the Saxon economy, with cattle serving not just as food sources, but as primary units of wealth and exchange. The size and quality of a family's herd determined social status, with successful cattle raids representing one of the primary paths to advancement for ambitious young warriors. Horses, while less numerous than cattle, held special significance both as status symbols and military assets. Saxon horse breeding techniques, developed on the grasslands of Lower Saxony, produced animals renowned for their stamina and sure-footedness, qualities that would prove invaluable in both warfare and long-distance travel. The development of specialized craft production in Saxon communities reflected growing social complexity and economic sophistication. Blacksmiths occupied positions of particular importance, their mastery of iron-working technology making them essential to both agricultural production and military preparedness. The techniques they developed for producing pattern-welded blades, combining different grades of steel to create weapons of exceptional flexibility and sharpness, would later influence sword-making traditions throughout medieval Europe. Pottery production, initially focused on utilitarian vessels for cooking and storage, gradually developed distinctive decorative traditions that archaeologists now use to trace Saxon cultural influence and population movement. The transformation of the Saxons from a primarily land-based society to accomplished seafarers represents one of the most significant developments in their early history. While their initial settlements concentrated on riverine and coastal locations for their access to resources and trade routes, by the 3rd century CE, Saxon groups had begun to develop sophisticated maritime capabilities. The evolution of Saxon shipbuilding can be traced through archaeological finds that show a gradual progression from simple dugout canoes and rivercraft to the clinker-built vessels capable of North Sea crossings that would carry Saxon raiders and settlers to new lands. The ships themselves represented remarkable achievements in engineering and craftsmanship. Built without formal plans or mathematical calculations, Saxon shipwrights relied on inherited knowledge and intuitive understanding of wood properties and hydrodynamics. The classic Saxon ship design, with its shallow draft, flexible hull, and combination of oars and sail, proved ideally suited to the varied conditions of North Sea navigation. These vessels could navigate rivers far inland, beach on any suitable shore without harbour facilities, and weather storms that would destroy more rigid construction. The Nidum ship, discovered in a Danish bog and dating to approximately 320 CE, provides our best evidence for early Saxon naval technology, its elegant lines and sophisticated construction revealing a tradition of shipbuilding already centuries in development. The crews that manned these vessels represented a cross-section of Saxon society, bound together by shared danger and the promise of reward. A typical raiding ship might carry between 30 and 40 warriors, each providing their own weapons and equipment while sharing in any plunder according to established custom. The skills required for successful maritime raiding, navigation, seamanship, combat coordination, and rapid tactical decision-making, created a distinct warrior culture that valued initiative and adaptability over rigid discipline. These maritime warbands operated with remarkable autonomy, their leaders chosen for proven ability rather than hereditary status, establishing patterns of merit-based leadership that would profoundly influence later Saxon political development. The impact of Roman contact on Saxon society, while less direct than for tribes along the Rhine frontier, proved nonetheless transformative. The Roman Empire's presence in Britain and along the continental North Sea coast created new economic opportunities and military challenges that fundamentally altered Saxon development. The elaborate frontier defences of the Saxon shore, constructed by Rome to defend against seaborne raiders, paradoxically served as training grounds where Saxon warriors learned Roman military techniques through repeated confrontation. Modern coins found in Saxon settlements from this period indicate participation in complex trade networks, with Saxon merchants and mercenaries acquiring not just material goods, but exposure to Roman administrative and organizational concepts. The recruitment of Saxon warriors as foederati, federated troops, serving Rome in exchange for payments and land grants, created channels for more intensive cultural exchange. Saxon units served in Britain, Gaul, and along the Danube frontier, gaining first-hand experience of Roman military organization, fortification techniques, and logistical systems. Veterans returning from Roman service brought new ideas about leadership, military organization, and even architectural styles that began to appear in high-status Saxon settlements. The practice of providing standardized military equipment to federated troops introduced Saxon warriors to Roman armor designs and weapon types that they would later adapt to their own manufacturing tradition. Yet this exposure to Roman civilization did not lead to wholesale adoption of Roman ways. The Saxons displayed remarkable cultural resilience, selectively incorporating useful elements while maintaining their distinctive identity. Latin loanwords entered the Saxon vocabulary primarily in areas related to trade and military technology, while core concepts related to society, religion, and governance retained their Germanic form. This selective adaptation would become a characteristic Saxon trait, visible later in their interactions with British Celtic populations and eventually with Norman French culture. The political evolution of Saxon society during the 4th and 5th centuries CE reflected the complex interplay of internal development and external pressure. The traditional system of temporary war leaders chosen for specific campaigns began giving way to more permanent forms of authority as the scale and frequency of military operations increased. The emergence of what continental sources term sea kings, successful war leaders who maintained permanent retinues and controlled maritime resources, represented a crucial transitional phase between tribal organization and territorial lordship. These figures commanded loyalty through a combination of successful leadership, generous gift-giving, and control over prestige goods obtained through raiding and trade. The institution of the Thing, the assembly of free warriors that served as both court and legislature, provided continuity with older traditions while adapting to new circumstances. These assemblies typically held at established sacred sites marked by standing stones or ancient trees, combined religious, judicial, and political functions. All free men could participate in discussions, though the influence of wealthy cattle owners and successful war leaders inevitably carried greater weight. The Thing's decisions required consensus rather than simple majority rule, encouraging elaborate negotiations and compromise that prevented the concentration of power while maintaining social cohesion. The role of women in early Saxon society, while often overlooked in martial-focused historical accounts, played crucial parts in maintaining social structures and economic productivity. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals that women controlled textile production, one of the most important industries in Saxon society. The quality of Saxon woolen cloth was renowned throughout northern Europe, with elaborately decorated garments serving as important status symbols and trade goods. Women also managed household economies during the frequent absence of men on raiding expeditions, making decisions about crop planting, animal husbandry, and local trade that required considerable autonomy and authority. High-status women could wield significant political influence, particularly as peace weavers through strategic marriages that created or reinforced alliances between different Saxon groups. The concept of the Frithweber, literally peace weaver, recognized women's formal role in conflict resolution and diplomacy. Queens and noblewomen controlled their own property, including land and movable wealth, which they could bequeath independently of their husbands' estates. Religious roles also provided avenues for female authority, with women serving as priestesses at important cult sites, and as keepers of tribal genealogies and oral traditions that legitimized political claims. The Saxon legal system, reconstructed from later law codes and continental analogies, reveals sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining order without centralized enforcement. The principle of collective responsibility meant that kinship groups had strong incentives to police their own members' behavior, as they would share liability for crimes and obligations to pay compensation. The system of compurgation, where accused individuals could clear themselves through oaths supported by oath helpers who swore to their truthfulness, created networks of reciprocal obligation that reinforced social bonds while providing dispute resolution. The complexity of Saxon legal concepts appears in their elaborate distinctions between different types of property, obligation, and injury. Land held by ancient right carried different obligations than land acquired through purchase or grant. Injuries were classified not just by severity but by the status of both perpetrator and victim, with elaborate schedules of compensation that reflected social hierarchies while providing alternatives to blood feuds. The concept of frith and grith created protected spaces and times when violence was forbidden, allowing for trade, religious observance, and political negotiation without fear of attack. The transformation of Saxon society accelerated during the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire's collapse created unprecedented opportunities and challenges. The withdrawal of Roman military forces from Britain in 410 CE opened that fertile island to Saxon expansion, while the breakdown of Roman authority along the continental coast removed constraints on Saxon maritime activity. This period, often characterized as one of chaos and destruction, actually witnessed remarkable Saxon adaptability and organization. Rather than random violence, Saxon expansion followed deliberate patterns that suggest careful planning and coordination among different groups. The traditional narrative of Saxon conquest, derived primarily from later British sources like Gildas and Bede, presents a simplified picture of violent invasion that archaeology increasingly challenges. Evidence from settlement sites suggests a more complex process involving gradual migration, intermarriage with British populations, and the transformation of existing communities rather than wholesale replacement. The appearance of Germanic-style pottery and building techniques in formerly Romano-British settlements often shows continuity of occupation rather than violent destruction and rebuilding. This pattern suggests that many Saxons arrived not as conquerors but as federates, merchants and settlers who gradually achieved dominance through demographic and cultural influence rather than purely military conquest. The development of early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain provides crucial evidence for understanding Saxon political evolution. The kingdoms that emerged, Kent, Essex, Sussex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, each developed distinct characteristics while maintaining recognizable Saxon institutions. The process by which warband leaders transformed themselves into territorial kings involved complex negotiations with existing populations, the adoption of some Romano-British administrative structures, and the gradual sacralization of royal authority that would culminate in Christian kingship. The case of Kent, traditionally the first Saxon kingdom established in Britain, illustrates this transformation. The kingdom's foundation myths, preserved in later sources, speak of Hengist and Horsa, legendary brothers who arrived as mercenaries serving British kings before establishing their own rule. Archaeological evidence from sites like Canterbury and Dover suggests continuity between Roman and Saxon periods, with Germanic material culture appearing gradually alongside British and residual Roman elements. The Kentish Law Code of Ethelbert, the earliest surviving English legal document, shows a sophisticated blend of Saxon custom, British practice, and continental influences that speaks to the kingdom's complex origins. The material culture of early Anglo-Saxon England reveals societies of considerable wealth and artistic sophistication. The grave goods from sites like Sutton Hoo, Taplow, and Prittlewell demonstrate access to luxury items from across the known world: Byzantine silver, Frankish gold coins, garnets from India or Sri Lanka, and hanging bowls of Celtic manufacture. These assemblages suggest that Saxon elites participated in far-reaching exchange networks, acquiring prestige goods that reinforced their authority while demonstrating the cosmopolitan nature of early medieval culture. The development of distinctive Anglo-Saxon art styles, particularly the Style I and Style II animal ornamentations, shows creative synthesis of diverse influences. Germanic animal art traditions merged with British Celtic patterns and Mediterranean motifs to create something uniquely Anglo-Saxon. The intricate interlace patterns that decorated metalwork, illuminated manuscripts, and stone sculpture required extraordinary skill and patience to execute, suggesting specialized craftsmen supported by wealthy patrons. These artistic traditions would reach their full flowering in works like the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Alfred Jewel, but their roots lay in the cultural fusion of the migration period. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, beginning with the Augustinian mission to Kent in 5097 CE, represented a profound transformation that went far beyond simple religious change. Christianity brought literacy, opening Saxon society to the accumulated knowledge of Mediterranean civilization. Monasteries became centers of learning where Latin texts were copied and studied alongside Old English composition. The Church provided models of hierarchical organization and administrative sophistication that Saxon kings adapted to strengthen their authority. Perhaps most importantly, Christianity offered a universalist ideology that could unite diverse populations under royal authority, transcending the particularist loyalties of tribe and kin. Yet the conversion process itself reveals characteristic Saxon adaptability. Rather than abandoning their traditions wholesale, Anglo-Saxons created a distinctive synthesis of Christian and Germanic elements. The Old English religious vocabulary adapted existing words for supernatural concepts rather than simply borrowing Latin terms, suggesting deliberate efforts to make Christianity comprehensible within Saxon cultural framework. Heroic values of loyalty, courage, and generosity found new expression in saints' lives and religious poetry, while Christian festivals absorbed elements of older seasonal celebration. The parallel development of Saxon societies on the continent followed different trajectories that illuminate the importance of specific historical circumstances in shaping cultural evolution. The Old Saxons, who remained in northern Germany, maintained their traditional political structures and pagan beliefs far longer than their Anglo-Saxon cousins, resisting Frankish expansion and Christian conversion until Charlemagne's brutal Saxon wars of the late 8th century. The contrasts between insular and continental Saxon development demonstrate that there was nothing inevitable about the particular path followed by the Anglo-Saxons. Continental Saxony's resistance to Carolingian conquest represents one of the most prolonged and bitter conflicts in early medieval history. For over 30 years, from 772 to 804 CE, Saxons fought to maintain their independence against the most powerful military force in Western Europe. The conflict's intensity stemmed not just from political resistance but from fundamental cultural and religious differences. The Saxons correctly perceived that acceptance of Christianity and Frankish overlordship would mean the end of their traditional way of life. Their resistance took forms ranging from open battlefield confrontation to guerrilla warfare, from political negotiation to religious revivalism, demonstrating the full range of strategies available to a decentralized society facing an existential threat. The figure of Widukind, the Saxon resistance leader who became a legendary figure in later traditions, embodied Saxon determination to maintain independence. His ability to unite normally fractious Saxon groups against external threat demonstrated the latent potential for coordinated action within Saxon society. Yet his eventual submission and baptism in 7085 CE equally demonstrated the limits of resistance against sustained military pressure backed by economic incentives and political accommodation. The terms of Saxon incorporation into the Carolingian Empire, while involving significant concessions to Saxon customs and laws, ultimately transformed continental Saxon society along lines similar to what had occurred voluntarily in Anglo-Saxon England. The economic transformations that accompanied political change profoundly altered Saxon society on both sides of the North Sea. The introduction of coinage as a regular medium of exchange, replacing the older system of barter and gift exchange, created new forms of wealth accumulation and economic relationships. Markets emerged at royal and ecclesiastical centers, attracting craftsmen and merchants who operated outside traditional kinship structure. The growth of towns, however modest by Mediterranean standards, created spaces where new forms of social organization could develop, challenging the rural, kin-based structures that had characterized earlier Saxon society. Agricultural intensification accompanied these changes, driven by the need to support larger populations and extract surpluses for elite consumption and trade. The three-field system, with its rotation of winter crops, spring crops, and fallow, replaced less intensive cultivation methods. Watermills appeared along suitable rivers, representing significant capital investments that required new forms of property rights and labor organization. The clearing of forests and draining of wetlands expanded cultivable area, while fundamentally altering landscapes that had remained largely unchanged since prehistoric times. The development of legal systems in Anglo-Saxon England provides unique insights into how Saxon society adapted to new circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity. The law codes issued by successive kings from Ethelbert of Kent to Canute show gradual evolution from statements of traditional custom to sophisticated legislative programs, addressing contemporary problems. Early codes primarily concern themselves with establishing tariffs of compensation for various injuries, reflecting the traditional Germanic emphasis on restitution over punishment. Later codes increasingly addressed issues of public order, trade regulation, and Christian morality, demonstrating growing royal authority and administrative sophistication. The institution of the hundred, a territorial unit responsible for local administration and justice, shows Saxon innovation in governance. Unlike the continental system of counts appointed by the king, the hundred court consisted of local freemen who met regularly to resolve disputes and maintain order. This system preserved elements of traditional Saxon self-governance while integrating them into royal administrative structure. The effectiveness of this system appears in its longevity, surviving the Norman conquest to influence English local government for centuries after. The Viking impact on Saxon societies beginning in the late 8th century created new challenges that accelerated political and social change. The initial raids targeted vulnerable coastal monasteries and trading centers, exploiting the same maritime mobility that had once given Saxons advantages over their enemies. The psychological impact of these attacks extended far beyond their immediate destruction, challenging assumptions about divine protection and royal authority that underpinned the Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The response to Viking threats drove military innovation, political centralization, and social mobilization on unprecedented scales. Alfred the Great's successful resistance to Viking conquest in Wessex demonstrated Saxon capacity for adaptive response to existential threat. His military reforms, including the creation of a network of fortified towns, burhs, and the division of military service to maintain standing forces while allowing agricultural production, showed sophisticated strategic thinking. His promotion of education and translation of key Latin texts into Old English reflected understanding that cultural renewal was essential to political survival. Most importantly, his articulation of a shared English identity transcending individual kingdom loyalties laid foundations for eventual political unification. The establishment of the Danelaw, regions of northern and eastern England under Scandinavian control, created laboratories for cultural fusion that paralleled earlier Saxon-British interaction. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable integration between Scandinavian newcomers and existing populations, with hybrid art styles, mixed burial customs, and bilingual place names indicating fluid cultural boundaries. The economic dynamism of Danelaw towns like York and Lincoln, which became major commercial centres, demonstrated benefits of cultural exchange that influenced English development long after political reconquest. The gradual conquest of the Danelaw by Wessex kings during the 10th century created the unified English kingdom, achieving a level of political integration unprecedented in Saxon history. This unification required delicate balancing of regional interests and identities, accommodation of Danish legal customs in formerly Scandinavian areas, and creation of administrative structures capable of governing diverse populations across a large territory. The success of this enterprise, however temporary given the later Danish conquest under Canute, demonstrated Saxon political sophistication and adaptability. The cultural flowering of late Anglo-Saxon England, particularly during the Benedictine reform movement of the 10th century, showed a society of remarkable intellectual and artistic vitality. Monastic scriptoriums produced illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty and complexity, combining insular artistic traditions with continental Carolingian influence. Old English literature reached new heights, with works ranging from religious homilies to secular poetry, from historical chronicles to scientific treatises. The development of a standardized Old English written language, promoted by Alfred and his successors, created a vernacular literary tradition unmatched elsewhere in Europe. The economic prosperity that underpinned this cultural achievement reflected sophisticated exploitation of England's natural resources and advantageous position in international trade networks. English wool became highly prized across Europe, establishing patterns of production and trade that would define the English economy for centuries. The revival of towns, many established as fortified burhs during the Viking Wars, created centers of craft production and commercial exchange. The introduction of a regulated coinage system with centralized minting standards facilitated trade while demonstrating royal authority. Social stratification in late Anglo-Saxon England had evolved far from the relatively egalitarian structures of early Saxon society. The emergence of a powerful aristocracy holding extensive landed estates worked by dependent peasants resembled continental feudal structures, though maintaining distinctive English characteristics. The institution of bookland, estates granted by royal charter that could be bequeathed outside traditional inheritance customs, created new forms of property that concentrated wealth and power. Yet elements of older Saxon traditions persisted, particularly in the continued importance of hundred courts and the theoretical right of all free men to participate in public assemblies. The Church's role in late Anglo-Saxon society extended far beyond purely religious function. Bishops and abbots ranked among the greatest landowners, controlling vast estates that supported religious communities, while generating surpluses for building projects and charitable works. Monasteries served as centers of education, producing the literate administrators essential for royal government. The Church's international connections facilitated diplomatic relations and cultural exchange, while its moral authority legitimized royal power and social hierarchy. Yet this close integration of secular and ecclesiastical authority also created tensions and conflicts that would persist throughout the medieval period. The military organization of late Anglo-Saxon England reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to contemporary challenges. The fyrd, theoretically encompassing all free men capable of bearing arms, preserved the principle of universal military obligation characteristic of early Saxon society. Yet practical military service increasingly fell to a semi-professional class of the gens, landowners obligated to provide equipped warriors in proportion to their hold. The huscarls, professional household warriors, maintained by kings and great nobles, represented the apex of military specialization, equipped with the finest weapons and armor available, and trained in sophisticated tactical formation. The complexity of English military organization appears in detailed administrative documents like the Burgol Hidage, which specified precisely how many men each district must provide for fortress garrison duty. This level of administrative sophistication, unmatched elsewhere in contemporary Europe, demonstrates the capability of Anglo-Saxon government to mobilize resources for public purposes. The construction and maintenance of the Burr network alone required enormous investments of labor and materials, coordinated across multiple regions and sustained over generations. The artistic achievements of late Anglo-Saxon England deserve special attention as expressions of cultural confidence and sophistication. The Winchester School of Manuscript Illumination developed a distinctive style characterized by elaborate acanthus leaf borders, dynamic figure drawing, and rich color palettes that influenced artistic production across Europe. Stone sculpture, particularly the great crosses of Northumbria and Mercia, combined Christian iconography with insular decorative traditions to create monuments of enduring power and beauty. Metalworking maintained the high standards established during the early Anglo-Saxon period, with pieces like the Fuller brooch demonstrating technical mastery and artistic innovation. Architecture also flourished, with churches growing in size and elaboration as communities competed to demonstrate piety and prosperity. The development of distinctive English Romanesque features, such as the use of long and short quoins and pilaster strips, shows creative adaptation of continental models to local traditions and materials. The great church at Glastonbury, described by William of Malmesbury, rivaled any ecclesiastical structure in Europe for size and magnificence, though Viking raids and later rebuilding have left only archaeological traces of its Anglo-Saxon glory. The intellectual life of late Anglo-Saxon England produced scholars of international reputation who contributed to European learning while developing distinctive English traditions. Elfric of Eynsham's homilies and educational works made Christian learning accessible to English speakers, while maintaining sophisticated theological understanding. His colleague Wulfstan's legal and homiletic writings showed deep engagement with contemporary moral and political issues. The anonymous author of the Old English Martyrology created an encyclopedic compilation that preserved vast amounts of historical and geographical knowledge. These achievements demonstrate that Anglo-Saxon England was not an intellectual backwater, but an active participant in the European cultural renaissance of the 10th and 11th centuries. The scientific and medical knowledge of Anglo-Saxon England, preserved in manuscripts like Bold's Leech Book and the Old English Herbarium, reveals sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena and practical healing. Recent laboratory testing of Anglo-Saxon medical recipes has shown that many possessed genuine therapeutic properties, challenging assumptions about medieval ignorance. The combination of classical learning, continental knowledge, and native traditions created a distinctive medical practice that served English communities effectively. Astronomical texts and computistical treatises demonstrate mathematical sophistication and careful observation of celestial phenomena, essential for calculating religious festivals and agricultural timing. The role of women in late Anglo-Saxon society showed both continuity with earlier traditions and evolution under Christian influence. Noble women could still exercise significant authority as landowners and patrons, with queens like Emma of Normandy wielding political influence that extended across multiple reigns. Convents provided spaces where aristocratic women could pursue education and exercise authority as abbesses governing substantial communities and estates. Yet Christianity also brought new constraints, with increasing emphasis on female virginity and submission that limited women's options. The tension between Saxon traditions of female property rights and continental practices of male primogeniture would continue to shape English law and society. The question of slavery in Anglo-Saxon England illuminates both the harsh realities of early medieval life and the slow transformation of social structures under Christian influence. Slavery remained a significant institution throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, with slaves constituting perhaps 10–20% of the population. War captives, debtors, and criminals could all be enslaved, while children of slaves inherited their parents' status. Yet Christianity gradually ameliorated the worst aspects of slavery, with manumission increasingly seen as a pious act, and church law providing some protections for slaves. The decline of slavery in favor of various forms of dependent peasant status represents one of the major social transformations of the period. Trade and commerce in late Anglo-Saxon England reached levels of sophistication that would not be matched again until the High Middle Ages. The port of London handled goods from across Europe, with archaeological evidence of wine from the Rhineland, pottery from northern France, silk from Byzantium, and spices from the Far East. English merchants travelled widely, with communities established in Scandinavian towns and along continental trade routes. The development of standard weights and measures, enforced by royal authority, facilitated commercial exchange, while demonstrating governmental capacity for economic regulation. The coinage system of late Anglo-Saxon England represented one of the most sophisticated monetary systems in contemporary Europe. Regular recoinage at intervals of 6 or 7 years maintained currency quality while generating revenue for the crown. The artistic quality of English coins with royal portraits and religious symbols served propaganda purposes while facilitating trade. The ability to produce millions of silver pennies for paying Danegeld tributes demonstrates remarkable administrative and economic capacity. The discovery of English coins across Europe and beyond testifies to their acceptance as reliable currency in international trade. The Danish conquest of England under Swing Forkbeard and his son Knut might seem to represent the failure of Anglo-Saxon society, but it actually demonstrated its sophisticated institutions' value. Knut maintained English administrative structures, law codes, and church organization, ruling through existing mechanisms rather than imposing Danish alternatives. His success as King of England, Denmark, and Norway depended largely on English resources and governmental systems. The Anglo-Danish state that emerged combined Scandinavian military power with English administrative sophistication, creating briefly one of the most powerful polities in Europe. The reign of Edward the Confessor, despite later hagiographic distortion, shows Anglo-Saxon England at the height of its prosperity and cultural achievement. The kingdom Edward ruled was wealthy, well-administered, and culturally sophisticated. Westminster Abbey, Edward's great building project, represented architectural ambition equal to any contemporary European monument. The Vita Edwardi Regis, commissioned by Queen Edith, demonstrates literary sophistication and political awareness. The Bayeux Tapestry's portrayal of Harold's embassy to Normandy shows English nobles as equal participants in European aristocratic culture. The governmental machinery of Edward's England operated with remarkable efficiency despite political tension. The Royal Writing Office produced writs and charters in both Latin and English, maintaining records of land ownership and legal privileges. The Treasury at Winchester managed royal revenues from diverse sources including land rents, judicial fines, commercial taxes and mining rights. The system of sheriffs, administering shires on behalf of the Crown, created unified administration across the kingdom. This governmental sophistication made England an attractive target for Norman ambition, while providing the administrative foundation for post-conquest success. The legacy of the Saxons extends far beyond medieval England to shape the modern world. The concept of representative government, with roots in Saxon assemblies, influenced democratic development across the English-speaking world and beyond. English common law, building on Saxon foundations, provides legal frameworks for numerous countries. The English language, preserving its Germanic core despite centuries of change, serves as the global lingua franca. Perhaps most importantly, the Saxon demonstration that disparate tribes could unite to create enduring institutions while maintaining local identities provides models for modern multicultural societies. Archaeological investigations continue to reveal new aspects of Saxon society, challenging established narratives and revealing unexpected sophistication. Recent discoveries like the Staffordshire hoard with its martial and religious artifacts force reconsideration of 7th century political and cultural dynamics. Environmental archaeology reveals climatic fluctuations that influenced agricultural productivity and settlement patterns. DNA analysis of cemetery populations shows more complex patterns of migration and intermarriage than traditional historical sources suggest. Each discovery adds nuance to our understanding, while confirming the remarkable adaptability that characterized Saxon society. The study of place names provides windows into Saxon settlement patterns and cultural values. The distribution of ing names, indicating early clan settlements, ham names suggesting established villages, and ton names marking later estate centers, reveals the progression of Saxon colonization. Field names preserve memories of forgotten pagan shrines, ancient boundaries, and historical events. River names, often preserving pre-Saxon Celtic forms, show accommodation with existing population. This linguistic landscape, still visible in modern maps, testifies to the enduring impact of Saxon settlement. The influence of Saxon Christianity on European culture deserves special recognition. The Anglo-Saxon missions to continental Europe, led by figures like Willibrord and Boniface, played crucial roles in converting pagan populations and reforming existing churches. These missionaries carried not just religious doctrine, but also Anglo-Saxon learning, artistic traditions, and organizational methods that influenced continental development. The scriptoria they established became centers for manuscript production that preserved classical learning, while creating new theological and historical works. Their emphasis on pastoral care and vernacular preaching made Christianity accessible to ordinary people in ways that Latin-dominated continental churches had failed to achieve. The economic innovations of Saxon society, particularly in agricultural technology and organization, transformed European landscapes. The heavy plough's adoption across northern Europe opened millions of acres to cultivation, supporting population growth that would drive medieval expansion. The Saxon system of open fields with communal management influenced agricultural organization from Ireland to Poland. Watermill technology, refined in Saxon contexts, spread across Europe as a fundamental power source for grinding grain, fulling cloth, and eventually powering early industrial processes. These technological transfers demonstrate how a supposedly barbarian society could innovate and influence more civilized regions. The concept of bookland introduced by the Saxons represented a revolutionary approach to property rights that influenced European legal development. Unlike traditional Germanic landholding based on kinship and custom, bookland could be freely alienated, bequeathed outside family lines, and accumulated without traditional restrictions. This created possibilities for capital accumulation and investment that contributed to economic development. The careful documentation required for bookland transactions promoted literacy and legal sophistication, while creating archives that preserved historical information. The tension between bookland and folkland reflected broader conflicts between individual and collective rights that continue to shape property law. Saxon contributions to military technology and tactics influenced European warfare for centuries. The shield wall formation, perfected by Saxon armies, provided defensive capabilities that could withstand cavalry charges when properly executed. The two-handed battle axe, particularly associated with Saxon huscarls, offered devastating striking power that influenced weapon development across Europe. Saxon fortification techniques, combining earth ramparts with wooden palisades, provided effective defense at lower cost than stone fortifications. The burh system demonstrated how fortified towns could serve simultaneously as military strongpoints, administrative centers, and commercial hubs, a model widely copied across medieval Europe. The Saxon approach to law and justice, emphasizing restitution over retribution and community involvement in legal proceedings, offered alternatives to Roman law traditions that influenced legal development across Europe. The concept of the peace, whether the king's peace, church peace, or market peace, created protected spaces and times that facilitated social and economic activity. The use of compurgation and ordeal, while seemingly primitive to modern eyes, reflected sophisticated understanding of social pressure and divine providence in maintaining order. The detailed tariffs of compensation for various injuries preserved in law codes reveal complex negotiations between royal authority and customary practice. The intellectual achievements of Saxon scholars extended beyond religious and historical writing to include significant contributions to natural philosophy and mathematics. Bede's De Temporibus and De Temporum Ratione advanced understanding of calendrical calculation and astronomical observation, becoming standard texts across medieval Europe. Berthworth of Ramsay's manual demonstrated sophisticated mathematical knowledge and pedagogical skill. The anonymous author of the Cotton Tiberius astronomical compilation preserved and transmitted Greek and Arabic astronomical knowledge. These works show Saxon scholars as active participants in international intellectual networks rather than passive recipients of continental learning. The development of Old English as a literary language represents one of Saxon society's most enduring achievements. Unlike most European vernaculars, which remained primarily oral until the High Middle Ages, Old English developed a rich written tradition encompassing poetry, prose, law, medicine, and science. The sophistication of Old English poetry, with its complex alliterative patterns, kennings, and formulaic expressions, required years of training to master. The flexibility of Old English prose, capable of expressing abstract theological concepts and practical instructions with equal clarity, demonstrated the language's maturity. This literary tradition provided models for later English writing, while preserving cultural memory across generations. The Saxon treatment of the landscape reveals a complex relationship with the natural world that combined practical exploitation with spiritual reverence. Sacred groves and springs preserved biodiversity while serving religious function. The clearing of forests for agriculture proceeded alongside recognition of woodland's value for hunting, gathering, and timber. Wetlands, initially seen as sacred thresholds, were gradually drained for agriculture, but never completely eliminated. This balanced approach to landscape management, negotiating between human needs and natural systems, offers lessons for contemporary environmental challenges. The role of craft guilds in Saxon towns prefigured later medieval guild organizations that would dominate European urban life. Groups of metal workers, leather workers, and textile producers organized to maintain quality standards, train apprentices, and to negotiate with authorities. These early professional associations provided mutual support for members while protecting trade secrets and limiting competition. The evolution from informal craft associations to formally chartered guilds demonstrates Saxon capacity for institutional innovation that balanced individual enterprise with collective interest. The Saxon approach to education, while limited by modern standards, showed remarkable commitment to learning given available resources. Cathedral schools provided basic education for future clergy, while also accepting some lay students. Monastic schools preserved classical learning while developing new pedagogical methods. The emphasis on memorization, while necessary given limited book availability, developed cognitive skills that modern education often neglects. The use of riddles, genealogies, and mnemonic verses made learning engaging while embedding knowledge in cultural contexts that aided retention. The medical practices of Saxon society, combining classical learning, empirical observation, and folk traditions, achieved surprising therapeutic successes. Recent analysis of remedies from Bald's Leech Book has shown antimicrobial properties that could effectively treat infections resistant to modern antibiotics. Saxon physicians understood the importance of wound cleaning, dietary regulation, and psychological factors in healing. The integration of prayer and ritual with practical treatment reflected holistic approaches to health that recognized connections between spiritual and physical well-being. The detailed observation of symptoms and progression of diseases, recorded in medical texts, demonstrates systematic approaches to understanding illness. The Saxon conception of time and history shaped European historical consciousness in profound ways. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles' year-by-year recording of events established annalistic traditions that influenced historical writing across Europe. The integration of biblical time, classical history, and local events created universal historical frameworks that connected regional experiences to cosmic significance. The calculation of Easter, requiring sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge, drove intellectual development while maintaining religious observance. The preservation of genealogies and origin legends provided identity and legitimacy for emerging medieval kingdoms. The transformation of Saxon society from pagan to Christian involved complex negotiations that preserved many traditional elements within Christian frameworks. Pagan festivals became Christian celebrations, with Yule becoming Christmas and spring fertility rites, influencing Easter observances. Sacred sites were Christianized through church construction, maintaining spatial continuity while transforming meaning. The warrior ethos found new expression in spiritual warfare and crusading ideology. This syncretistic process created forms of Christianity distinctive to Saxon contexts, while maintaining connection to universal church traditions. The Saxon influence on medieval literature extended beyond direct Old English compositions to shape European literary tradition. The epic Beowulf influenced later medieval romances, with its combination of heroic action and moral reflection. The elegiac tradition of works like The Wanderer and The Seafarer provided models for expressing loss and exile that resonated across culture. The riddling tradition influenced medieval Latin poetry and vernacular compositions. Anglo-Saxon hagiography established patterns for saints' lives that spread across Europe. These literary influences demonstrate how a relatively small population could shape continental cultural development. The question of Saxon identity itself reveals complex negotiations between ethnic, political, and cultural factors that remain relevant to modern discussions of nationality and belonging. Saxon identity could be claimed through birth, gained through alliance, or lost through betrayal. The absorption of British, Danish, and other populations into Saxon kingdoms shows fluid ethnic boundaries despite rhetoric of distinct peoples. The creation of English identity from diverse Saxon, Anglian and other groups demonstrates how political projects can forge new ethnicity. The persistence of regional identities within unified England shows how multiple levels of belonging can coexist. The economic sophistication of late Saxon England appears in detailed estate surveys that reveal complex agricultural systems, diverse craft production, and extensive trade networks. The Rectitudine Singularum Personarum describes elaborate labour obligations and rights that structured rural society. The Gerefa outlines estate management practices that maximize productivity while maintaining social obligations. These documents show agricultural systems capable of producing substantial surpluses that supported non-agricultural populations and enabled cultural achievements. The diversity of occupations recorded in Domesday Book, from beekeepers to bell founders, demonstrates economic complexity rivaling any contemporary European society. The Saxon contributions to navigation and seamanship influenced maritime development across northern Europe. Saxon navigational techniques, relying on coastal landmarks, celestial observation, and understanding of tides and currents, enabled reliable sea travel without magnetic compasses or detailed charts. The shallow draft vessel designs they perfected allowed navigation of rivers and coastal waters, inaccessible to deeper draft ships. Saxon understanding of seasonal weather patterns and sea conditions informed sailing calendars that minimized risk. These maritime traditions, transmitted through practical experience rather than written manuals, sustained North Sea trade networks that connected Britain to continental Europe. The role of marriage in Saxon society extended beyond personal relationships to serve crucial political, economic, and social functions. Marriage alliances created networks of obligation that could prevent conflicts or mobilize support. The mourning gift tradition provided economic security for wives independent of their husband's control. The recognition of different forms of marriage, from formal church ceremonies to common law arrangements, accommodated diverse circumstances while maintaining social order. The gradual imposition of church marriage rules created tensions with traditional practices that influenced legal development for centuries. The Saxon approach to childhood and child-rearing, while harsh by modern standards, showed awareness of developmental stages and educational needs. The practice of fostering, sending children to be raised in other households, created social bonds while providing diverse educational experiences. Age-graded responsibilities introduced children gradually to adult roles. The recognition of childhood as a distinct life stage appears in legal protections and reduced penalties for young offenders. Educational texts designed specifically for children, like Elfric's Colloquy, show pedagogical sophistication in making learning engaging and relevant. The treatment of the elderly in Saxon society reveals values of respect for experience and wisdom balanced against practical limitation. Elderly people who could no longer perform physical labor might serve as counselors, storytellers, or ritual specialists. Retirement arrangements, recorded in wills and charters, show families providing for elderly members through designated support. The concept of the wise elder appears repeatedly in literature and law, suggesting cultural value placed on accumulated knowledge. Yet the harsh realities of early medieval life meant many people didn't survive to old age, making the elderly a relatively small but respected minority. The Saxon response to disability and illness shows both compassion and pragmatism. Law codes prescribed compensation for injuries that caused disability, recognizing economic impacts on individuals and families. Monasteries provided care for those unable to support themselves, developing early forms of institutional health care. The attribution of some disabilities to divine punishment or demonic influence led to spiritual alongside practical treatment. The integration of disabled individuals into community life, when possible, demonstrated inclusive values within resource constraints. The development of Saxon coinage from primitive schetas to sophisticated silver pennies traces economic and political evolution. Early coins served more as stores of value and status symbols than regular currency. The standardization of coinage, under Offa and his successors, created reliable exchange media that facilitated trade. The artistic quality of Saxon coins featuring royal portraits and religious symbols served propaganda purposes while demonstrating technical skill. The ability to recall and reissue coinage demonstrated governmental power and administrative sophistication that few contemporary states could match. The Saxon understanding of geography in the wider world, while limited by modern standards, showed curiosity and systematic observation. Texts like the Old English Orosius included updated geographical information based on contemporary travelers' reports. The Cotton Tiberius map, while schematic, demonstrates attempts to visualize global geography within theological framework. Trading contacts brought knowledge of distant lands and peoples that influenced Saxon worldviews. The preservation and transmission of classical geographical knowledge through Saxon manuscripts contributed to medieval European understanding of the world. The role of dreams and visions in Saxon culture reveals different epistemologies that valued revealed knowledge alongside empirical observation. Dream visions provided divine guidance for political decisions, religious conversions, and personal conduct. The recording and interpretation of significant dreams created textual traditions that influenced medieval vision literature. The boundary between waking and sleeping experience appeared more permeable than in modern consciousness, allowing for different forms of knowledge and experience. This openness to non-rational forms of understanding enriched Saxon culture, while sometimes conflicting with Christian orthodoxy. The Saxon approach to death and burial reveals complex beliefs about afterlife, identity, and community bonds that persisted through religious change. Grave goods in pagan burials demonstrated belief in continued existence requiring material support. Christian burial practices eliminated grave goods, but maintained concern for proper treatment of the dead. The location of burials, in relation to settlements and churches, reflected beliefs about continuing relationships between living and dead. Commemorative practices, from elaborate monuments to simple wooden markers, showed varying resources and values while maintaining fundamental respect for the deceased. The transformation of Saxon weaponry from functional tools to symbolic objects traces changing relationships between violence, authority, and identity. Early Saxon weapons emphasized practical effectiveness, with simple but well-made spears and shields accessible to most warriors. The development of pattern-welded swords created weapons that combined practical function with artistic display. By the late Saxon period, elaborate decorated weapons served primarily as status symbols and ceremonial objects. This evolution from functional to symbolic reflects broader transformations in Saxon society, from warrior culture to settled kingdom. The Saxon contribution to European horse breeding and equestrian culture deserves recognition alongside their more famous maritime achievements. Saxon horse breeding, particularly in Lower Saxony, produced animals renowned for stamina and temperament. The development of specialized horse furniture, from saddles to bridles, improved riding comfort and control. Saxon cavalry tactics, while less dominant than infantry, influenced military practice across Europe. The cultural significance of horses in Saxon society appears in law codes prescribing their values and in literature celebrating their quality. The preservation strategies employed by Saxon scholars to maintain textual traditions across centuries of disruption demonstrate sophisticated understanding of information management. Multiple copies of important texts were distributed across different centers to ensure survival. Texts were regularly recopied to prevent deterioration, with careful checking to maintain accuracy. The development of library catalogues and finding aids facilitated access to preserved knowledge. These practices, developed in response to Viking raids and other threats, created resilient information networks that preserved learning through repeated crises. The Saxon engagement with the supernatural reveals worldviews that integrated material and spiritual realms in ways foreign to modern secular thought. Elves, dragons, and other supernatural beings inhabited the same landscapes as humans, requiring negotiation and respect. The efficacy of curses, blessings and charms was assumed rather than debated. The boundary between natural and supernatural appeared fluid rather than fixed. This enchanted worldview enriched Saxon culture, while creating categories of experience that modern rationalism struggles to accommodate. The economic role of women in Saxon society extended beyond domestic production to include significant participation in trade and craft production. Women controlled textile production from sheep raising through cloth finishing, managing one of the economy's most important sectors. Female merchants appear in documentary sources trading locally and internationally. Nonnaries functioned as economic enterprises, managing estates and producing goods for sale. The economic agency available to Saxon women, while constrained by social expectations, exceeded that in many later medieval contexts. The Saxon approach to conflict resolution through compensation, rather than punishment, influenced European legal development toward restorative, rather than retributive justice. The detailed schedules of wergilds and fines for various offences reflected sophisticated understanding of social values and economic relationships. The emphasis on restoring social harmony rather than abstract justice created flexible systems that could accommodate diverse circumstances. The involvement of communities in negotiating settlements ensured broad acceptance of resolutions. These approaches to justice, while different from modern legal systems, offer alternatives worth considering for contemporary conflict resolution. The development of Saxon administrative documents from simple records to complex bureaucratic systems traces governmental evolution. Early charters simply recorded transactions, but later documents included detailed conditions, exceptions, and enforcement mechanisms. The standardization of diplomatic formulas facilitated document production while ensuring legal validity. The preservation of administrative records created institutional memory that enabled consistent governance across generations. The sophistication of late Saxon administration, revealed through surviving documents, rivaled any contemporary European government. The Saxon influence on English place names created a linguistic landscape that preserves historical memory in everyday geography. Settlement names record founding families, landscape features, and economic activities from over a millennium ago. Field names preserve agricultural practices, property boundaries, and historical events. River and forest names often preserve pre-Saxon Celtic forms, demonstrating cultural continuity. This toponymic heritage provides evidence for historical processes, otherwise undocumented, while creating identity connections between modern populations and ancient lands. The role of commemoration in Saxon culture, from genealogies to monuments, reveals how societies construct and maintain collective memory. Royal genealogies traced descent from gods and heroes, legitimizing authority through claimed antiquity. Chronicle entries preserved memory of significant events for future generations. Stone crosses and churches materialized memory in landscape. These commemorative practices created usable pasts that served contemporary needs, while preserving genuine historical information. The tension between historical accuracy and political utility in commemoration remains relevant to modern memorial practices. The Saxon conception of labor combined practical necessity with moral and spiritual significance that influenced European work ethics. Manual labor, rather than being despised as servile, could demonstrate virtue and contribute to salvation. The Benedictine emphasis on ore et labore found receptive audiences in Saxon contexts, where work already carried moral weight. The organization of labor through seasonal cycles and communal obligations created rhythms that balanced individual and collective needs. This understanding of work as meaningful activity, rather than mere economic necessity, offers alternatives to modern alienated labor. The transformation of Saxon warfare from tribal raiding to organized military service traces broader social evolution. Early Saxon warfare emphasized individual prowess and small-scale raids for portable wealth. The development of defensive systems like the burghs required coordinated labor and sustained commitment, Late Saxon armies combined professional warriors with militia levies in sophisticated tactical systems. The evolution from warfare as elite privilege to military service as common obligation democratized violence, while subjecting it to royal control. These transformations in military organization both reflected and drove broader social changes. The Saxon engagement with literacy transformed from elite accomplishment to broader social tool across the period. Initially, literacy remained confined to clergy and the highest elite. The expansion of government created demands for literate administrators below the highest levels. Commercial development required merchants and craftsmen to maintain records. By the late Saxon period, functional literacy extended well beyond traditional educated elites. This expansion of literacy, while still limited by modern standards, created possibilities for social mobility and cultural participation that challenged traditional hierarchies. The role of ritual in Saxon society extended beyond religious observance to structure social relationships and political authority. Coronation rituals transformed war leaders into sacred kings. Oath-taking ceremonies created binding obligations enforced by supernatural sanction. Seasonal festivals reinforced community bonds while marking temporal transitions. Guild ceremonies initiated members into professional mysteries. These rituals created meaning and order in potentially chaotic social worlds while providing frameworks for understanding change and continuity. The Saxon contribution to European architectural traditions extended beyond famous churches to include vernacular building techniques that influenced ordinary construction for centuries. Timber framing methods developed in Saxon contexts spread across northern Europe as efficient building systems. The combination of timber superstructures with stone foundations created durable yet flexible buildings. Saxon techniques for waterproofing, insulation, and ventilation improved living conditions. These practical architectural innovations, while less celebrated than grand churches, improved daily life for millions of Europeans. The development of Saxon intellectual culture from oral tradition to written learning required fundamental transformations in how knowledge was conceived, preserved, and transmitted. Oral traditions emphasized memorization, formulaic composition, and performance skills. Written culture required different cognitive abilities and created new possibilities for complex argument and detailed record-keeping. The coexistence of oral and written traditions in Saxon contexts created hybrid forms that enriched both. The successful negotiation of this transformation provided models for other societies experiencing similar transitions. The Saxon understanding of property rights evolved from communal ownership through kinship-based systems to increasingly individual control, tracing broader European development toward private property. Early Saxon property concepts emphasized use rights rather than absolute ownership. The introduction of bookland created alienable property that could be accumulated and transferred outside kinship structures. The tension between communal and individual property rights generated legal innovations that balanced social obligations with economic incentive. These property transformations both enabled and reflected broader economic and social changes. The role of feasting in Saxon society extended beyond mere consumption to serve crucial social, political, and economic functions. Feasts redistributed wealth through generous hospitality. They reinforced social hierarchies through seating arrangements and food distributions. They provided occasions for political negotiations and alliance building. They marked significant transitions in individual and community life cycle. The competitive hospitality documented in sources like Beowulf reveals how feasting served as arena for status competition. These functions of commensality, while taking different forms, remain relevant to modern social organization. The Saxon approach to mental illness and psychological distress, while influenced by supernatural explanations, showed awareness of various conditions and attempted treatments. Melancholy, madness, and possession were recognized as distinct conditions requiring different responses. Herbal remedies, dietary restrictions, and ritual treatments addressed mental as well as physical symptoms. The community support available through kinship and religious institutions provided care for those unable to function independently. While treatments often proved ineffective by modern standards, the recognition of mental illness as requiring intervention rather than simple exclusion showed relative compassion. The transformation of Saxon kingship from warrior leadership to sacred monarchy involved complex negotiations between Germanic traditions and Christian ideology. Early Saxon leaders derived authority from military success and generous gift-giving. The adoption of Christianity added divine sanction to royal authority, but also imposed moral obligations. The development of coronation rituals created sacred dimensions to kingship that transcended personal quality. By the late Saxon period, kings claimed authority as God's representatives, while remaining bound by law and custom. This evolution of royal ideology influenced European concepts of monarchy for centuries. The Saxon contribution to European legal traditions, through the development of common law principles, deserves special recognition. The emphasis on precedent rather than abstract principle created flexible legal systems that could adapt to changing circumstances. The involvement of local communities in legal proceedings through juries and hundred courts democratized justice. The detailed recording of cases created legal memory that ensured consistency. The balance between royal authority and customary law created spaces for legal innovation, while maintaining stability. These common law traditions, exported globally through British imperialism, continue to influence legal systems worldwide. The role of pilgrimage in Saxon society connected local communities to universal Christianity, while providing frameworks for understanding space and movement. Pilgrimage to Rome exposed Saxon travelers to Mediterranean culture and papal authority. Local pilgrimage sites created sacred geographies that structured regional identities. The obligations to assist pilgrims created networks of hospitality that facilitated other forms of travel. Pilgrimage narratives provided models for spiritual journey that influenced literature and theology. These practices of sacred travel, while specifically Christian, built on older traditions of ritual movement through landscapes. The Saxon engagement with the classical past through manuscript copying and commentary preserved ancient learning, while adapting it to contemporary needs. Saxon scholars didn't simply copy classical texts but added glosses, translations, and commentary that made them accessible to new audiences. The selection of which texts to preserve and which to ignore reflected Saxon values and interests. The integration of classical learning with Christian theology created synthetic traditions that enriched both. This active engagement with the classical heritage, rather than passive preservation, demonstrates Saxon intellectual vitality. The development of Saxon naval power from coastal raiding to organized fleets capable of major operations traces broader transformations in political and economic capacity. Early Saxon maritime activity consisted of seasonal raids by small groups. The Viking threat prompted development of coordinated naval defense, requiring substantial resources. Alfred's creation of a royal fleet represented new levels of governmental organization and resource mobilization. By the 11th century, English naval forces could project power across the North Sea. This evolution of naval capacity both reflected and enabled Saxon political development. The role of exile in Saxon society served multiple functions, from punishment to opportunity for advancement. Political exiles might find service with foreign rulers, gaining experience and resources for eventual return. Religious exiles sought sanctity through voluntary separation from homeland. Economic exiles pursued opportunities unavailable at home. The networks created by Saxon exiles facilitated cultural exchange and political intelligence. The theme of exile in Saxon literature reflects its psychological and social significance. These experiences of displacement and return enriched Saxon culture, while writing connections across political boundaries. The Saxon approach to animal husbandry went beyond mere economic exploitation to reflect complex relationships with domestic animals. Laws prescribed penalties for animal cruelty that recognized animal suffering. The close observation required for successful breeding produced detailed knowledge of animal behavior. The emotional bonds between humans and animals appear in literature and grave goods. The symbolic significance of various animals influenced social and political imagery. These multifaceted relationships with animals reveal Saxon society as more than simply exploitative, showing awareness of animal consciousness and value beyond economic utility. The transformation of Saxon diet from the migration period through the late Anglo-Saxon era reflects broader economic and cultural changes. Early Saxon diet emphasized meat and dairy from pastoral production. Agricultural intensification increased availability of bread and porridge. Trade brought wine, exotic spices, and preserved foods that diversified elite diet. Christian fasting rules modified consumption patterns and created demand for fish. The development of food preservation techniques enabled year-round dietary variety. These dietary changes both reflected and influenced social structures, agricultural practices, and trade networks. The Saxon contribution to European monetary systems through innovations in coinage and financial administration influenced economic development across the continent. The regular recoinage system developed in late Anglo-Saxon England provided models for monetary management. The high quality of English silver pennies made them preferred currency for international trade. The development of accounting systems to manage royal revenues influenced administrative practices elsewhere. The concept of monetary crimes and regulations to maintain currency quality spread through Saxon influence. These financial innovations facilitated economic growth while demonstrating governmental sophistication. The role of gossip and reputation in Saxon society reveals informal social control mechanisms that complemented formal legal structures. Reputation determined creditworthiness, marriage prospects, and social standing. Gossip networks transmitted information about behavior that influenced community responses. The concept of good fame appears repeatedly in legal and literary sources as essential to social participation. The destruction of reputation through slander was severely punished, recognizing its social impact. These informal regulatory mechanisms, while subject to abuse, provided flexible responses to behavior that formal law couldn't easily address. The Saxon understanding of space and territory evolved from fluid tribal ranges to fixed administrative boundaries, reflecting broader transformations in political organization. Early Saxon territories were defined by use rather than abstract boundary. The development of shires and hundreds created administrative geometries that structured governance. The recording of estate boundaries in charters required new precision in spatial description. The concept of the kingdom as bounded territory rather than network of relationships marked fundamental political change. These evolving spatial concepts influenced European development toward territorial states. The transformation of Saxon material culture from migration period simplicity to late Anglo-Saxon sophistication traces economic and social development. Early Saxon material culture emphasized portable wealth and functional objects. Increasing settlement stability enabled accumulation of immovable wealth and decorative objects. Growing trade networks brought exotic materials and new techniques. Craft specialization produced increasingly sophisticated products. By the late Saxon period, material culture rivaled any in contemporary Europe. This transformation in material culture both reflected and enabled broader social and economic changes. The Saxon engagement with prophecy and prognostication reveals epistemologies that valued divine revelation and pattern recognition alongside empirical observation. Political prophecies influenced decision-making at the highest levels. Medical prognostications guided treatment choices. Agricultural predictions determined planting and harvesting times. Dream interpretation provided personal guidance. These predictive practices, while often inaccurate, provided frameworks for understanding uncertainty and making decisions under conditions of limited information. The role of vengeance in Saxon society, while constrained by legal and religious structures, remained a powerful force shaping behavior and social relations. The duty to avenge kin injuries motivated feuds that could persist across generations. The transformation of vengeance obligations into legal compensation represented major social achievement. Christian emphasis on forgiveness conflicted with honor requirements for vengeance. Literature like Beowulf explores tensions between vengeance and social order. The gradual suppression of vengeance cultures in favor of state justice marked fundamental transformation in social organization. The Saxon contribution to European agricultural innovation through crop rotation systems and field management techniques increased productivity and supported population growth. The three-field system developed in Saxon contexts balanced soil fertility maintenance with maximum production. The integration of animal husbandry with crop production through managed grazing and manuring improved yields. The development of specialized agricultural tools adapted to local conditions improved efficiency. Common field management systems balanced individual and collective interests. These agricultural innovations spread across Europe, supporting medieval population expansion. As we reflect on the thousand-year journey of the Saxon peoples from the marshlands of northern Germany to the creation of England and their influence across Europe, we see not simply a story of conquest and kingdom building, but a remarkable demonstration of human adaptability and cultural creativity. The Saxons transformed themselves from tribal confederations to sophisticated kingdoms, from pagan warriors to Christian scholars, from isolated communities to participants in European-wide networks of trade, learning and culture. Their greatest achievement may have been their ability to synthesize diverse influences while maintaining distinctive identity. They absorbed Roman administrative techniques, Christian theology, Celtic artistic traditions and Scandinavian military innovations while creating something uniquely their own. The English language, common law, and representative government that emerged from Saxon foundations continue to influence billions of people worldwide. The Saxon story reminds us that historical transformations result not from inevitable forces, but from countless individual decisions and adaptations. Each Saxon farmer who adopted the heavy plough, each warrior who accepted Christian baptism, each scribe who copied a manuscript contributed to transformations whose full implications they could never have foreseen. Their successes and failures, preserved in archaeological remains and written records, provide insights relevant to contemporary challenges of cultural contact, political organization, and social change. The end of Anglo-Saxon England in 1066 marked not failure but transformation. The culture, institutions, and values developed over 6 centuries of Saxon presence in Britain persisted under new management, eventually absorbing Norman conquerors as earlier they had absorbed British and Danish influence. The resilience and adaptability that characterized Saxon society from its earliest emergence in the German marshlands ensured its influence would extend far beyond its political demise. In studying the Saxons, we encounter not distant others but contributors to traditions we inhabit. Their struggles with questions of identity, governance, and cultural change resonate with contemporary challenges. Their solutions, while specific to their circumstances, offer perspectives worth considering. Their demonstration that small communities can influence world history through cultural creativity, rather than military might alone, provides hope for those who seek to contribute to human development without commanding vast resources. The Saxon legacy lives not in racial descent or national boundaries, but in ideas and institutions available to all humanity. Their transformation of law from vengeance to compensation, of government from personal loyalty to institutional structures, of learning from oral tradition to written culture, created tools for human organization that transcend their origin. In this sense, we are all heirs to Saxon achievements, beneficiaries of their innovations, and students of their examples.